afternoon and welcome, good gentles. This is the June 2026 University class on building arrows for target archery. My name is Nicholas Trent. I'm a member of the UBO, and this class is being brought to you by the UBO membership. I reside in the Windmasters Hills area, or the greater Raleigh-Durham area, with my wife Jenny, and we've been very active in the archery community the last few years. We wanted to spend the next hour with you and basically share experiences that I've built on the art of building arrows. I think you'll find it to be a very enjoyable pastime and really expand your knowledge of not only how arrows are constructed, but also put you in a better position to repair any problem arrows that you might have. Additionally, it's a wonderful way of expressing yourself because you can incorporate any colors or any decorations into your arrows and certainly make them more unique than what you can buy on the open market. Hopefully, with your knowledge, as you start building your own arrows, you'll become a resource to your archery community and can share your skills with the folks around you. Another area that we look for as we look for people to elevate them from the novice to missileers to a UBO to a mark. Now, have you considered making your own arrows, and is that a skill that you can pass on to others? Kind of go through what we're going to be covering today. I'm going to do just a quick overview of the different main areas that we'll be discussing today. I'll do that pretty fast, but you'll find a lot more of the verbiage in the slides so you can come back to it at a later point. My focus is really going to be on the right side of your screen, building arrows, the process. And so I'm going to take you through a process that I have developed. And it may not be the same process that you use or that other people that you know use. I may be using different glues, different stains, sealers, and it's simply that's the experience that I've developed up to this point, and it may change over time. But I'm going to try to share that experience with you, and it's my goal to help you to understand that it's really not as difficult as it might sound to make your own arrows. And hopefully I can help you through that process. So let's get started. I think everybody has probably heard the term of matching the arrows to the archer. You want to make sure that the arrow is going to fit on the bow and your draw length. You can't be using too short of an arrow, obviously. And then your bow is going to require a certain strength in the arrow. That strength is often measured in terms of the spine of the arrow. And that spine relates to how much the arrow is able to flex. It needs to flex in order to work its way around the bow when that string is pushing it off of your bow. And that flex needs to actually happen to let it bend around the bow, and then it's going to bend right back as it stabilizes on its way to the target. And so if you haven't thought about spine ranges, if you'll do some queries on the internet, you'll find some tables of spine ranges for wooden arrows that you can look at to then say, I've got a 30-pound bow and I have a 28-inch draw. What spine rate would be the best point for me to start on? And it'll give you a starting point that you can then, if you need be, order a set of arrows and try them out, or start making your own sets of arrows. But the nice thing about the market right now is you can actually order arrows that are pre-spined for you, and oftentimes that are already weighed and matched. And so it saves you on having to have that additional equipment since you can just order it from a couple of companies. So we're going to go through different sections. The first section is going to talk about sealing and staining your arrows. This is important because we're trying to reduce the amount of moisture that the wood will absorb. And it's also going to help strengthen the wood. And we'll take you through that process. It's very straightforward. You also want to try to do this after you've checked your wood shafts to make sure that they're true or that they don't have any bends in them. And I'm going to even show you how to do that, which is a little more of an art. So we'll just kind of scan through that real quick. Afterwards, we're going to jump into decorating or personalizing arrows. There's a variety of ways to do that. If you're trying to make period arrows, you can make simple marks on the arrows that would represent who you are. If you want to get a little more elaborate, you can get into areas like crown dipping or even cresting. And we're going to show you how to use a cresting tool which allows you then to really make some nice, attractive arrows and to, of course, personalize them to your colors and so forth. Fletching, a lot of people probably have had some experience with fletching. We're going to show you one of the more common jigs on the market. In the SCA, we do require that you use natural materials for your fletches. No plastic fletching, of course. And there's a wide variety of fletches available on the market from sizes to colors. Nocks and points. You can use plastic nocks, obviously, for target archery, but if you're trying to compete in the period category, you'll need to use self nocks. And so I'll take you through how to either add glue-on self nocks or even cut your own nocks. And for points, there's a lot of points out there. And of course, we want to avoid any points that are not appropriate for target archery, where those points could tear up the targets. And so we're trying to use simple ones for that are designed for target archeries, and they come in a variety of sizes and weights. And that weight can have an effect on how your arrow actually flexes. And so it's important to pay attention to those weights as we move on. Without further ado, let's jump into the process of making arrows. The first couple of slides here I've termed in terms of just prepping the wood shafts. So let's assume at this point you've ordered a set of wood shafts from a company, and they may have determined, or you may have told them you want a specific spine that you picked would be the right one for your bow. And they'll send you a dozen, they'll send you 2 dozen, whatever the case might be. The first thing you want to do is give each shaft a quick sanding with a light grit sandpaper. And then you can also taper the shafts in preparation for putting the nocks on the end. Here's a difficult topic, and I put optional because some people actually may not take the time to do this, but it's an important topic to me, and that is looking at rifts on the shafts. And I'm going to start up a video to show you what I mean. And rifts are, of course, where the wood grain comes together and forms a V. And it might be kind of hard to see on your display, but when I look at these rifts, I can point towards these little V's, and right now they're pointing towards the point of my arrow or the tip of my arrow. When I rotate the shaft 180 degrees, those rifts are now going to be pointing in the opposite direction towards the nock of the arrow. So now going back to the original orientation, my rift's now pointing to the point or the front of the arrow. I want those to be on the top of my arrow. And so being a right-handed bowyer, I've got my cock arrow in white pointing to the left. And basically the rifts are going to be on the top pointing to the point. And the important part of that is the fact that oftentimes, if a wood arrow is going to break, it's going to break on those rifts. And those rifts can be rather jagged. If that arrow breaks and it breaks downward, we want that rift not to be pointing forward and having the issue of actually penetrating your hand should it catch your hand as the arrow is moving forward. We want it pointing backwards to have less chance of damaging your hand. And that's the whole purpose of kind of looking at these rifts and orienting them and making sure that they're oriented as you put your cock feather and your nock in place. So I know that's a kind of a difficult topic, and some of you might want to discuss it further, or maybe you couldn't quite understand what I was trying to convey, but that's just a quick comment. One of those safety issues that makes it better in the long term, because every archer has a story of how an arrow broke and went into his hand. Just measuring your arrows is very straightforward. There are grain scales that let you do that, and it's quite simple. These grain scales are rather cheap. The other half of prepping the wood shafts, and this is gonna, once again, kind of be a little more of a complex topic, but once we get through this, everything else gets easier, and that's straightening the shafts. In my opinion, a better fletcher is one that has gone through these steps of straightening the shafts before they start building their arrows. A lot of us probably never even think about that. In fact, we'll order a set of arrows and we'll never think about checking whether or not there's any bends in the wood. And it's an important topic. If you want to be a better archer, you've got to have better arrows. Let me kind of take you through my method of straightening arrows. I take a flat surface like a granite countertop or maybe a glass countertop for a table. I'll roll my arrow and you see how it kind of wobbles and stops rolling. You know there's a bend there. And if you put your eye at eye level along the base, you'll see that little area of light underneath the shaft. That's showing you that the bend is forcing the arrow upwards. I'll then grab that arrow and kind of bend it in the opposite direction, trying to force the wood to bend back and try to straighten. You'll be lucky if you do it on your first try. Oftentimes you have to do this multiple times in order to get rid of that bend. There's another tool put out by a company by the name of Ace that allows you to actually burnish the high side of these arrows by rubbing it back and forth, and that friction and pressure kind of presses down on the fibers and it'll help counteract the bend. Oftentimes, though, if it's a heavy bend, I'll do a combination of using that tool and then I'll follow it up with my fingers once again, still pressing, trying to go against that bend. This is just something you have to do over and over again until you feel comfortable that when you roll that shaft, that it's going to roll pretty well. If you don't have a flat surface like that, the other way is simply to look down the length of the shaft with your eye, rotate it, and then use your palm and your fingers to bend the shaft as you can. That's an idea of straightening. You can also do that with existing arrows where you just kind of keep the feathers and the point off of your flat surface and just try to roll the base of the arrow or the wood on the flat surface to see if you come across any bends. Prepping the arrows. Now let's get into staining and sealing. Staining is really straightforward. In fact, you're going to use such a minor amount of stain that it's almost not worth buying a quart of stain. But the nice thing in the Minwax line of products that you can get from Lowe's is they can sell you just about any color that you want. In the old days, it used to be the colors of wood, you know, mahogany, cedar, and so forth. Now you can get variations on red, blue, green, and actually put a stain across the entire length of your arrow shaft in those colors, which is kind of nice. And they'll mix them over at Lowe's, and they've got a wide selection of colors that you can choose from. So the stain can be applied to the entire length of the arrow, or you can choose to not do the last 9 inches, which we call the crown, where your feathers or fletching are going to go. And you can decide to either dip those in paint or maybe even use a different color stain on that end. So sealing, and let me jump over here to the next video over here, is also a pretty straightforward process. I'm using one of the True North products, which is a satin sealer. I'm pouring it into a dipping tube, and then I'm using this arrow that has some rubber bands tied around it to actually mix it up and to try to pull up some of the particles that have kind of floated down to the bottom so that it mixes up in the tube. These are tubes that are designed to allow you to dip your arrows. And now I've got my arrows on clips and I'm just dipping them into the solution. I've got a funnel here on top of the dipping tube to make it a little easier to capture some of the liquid as it drains off the tube. And as I'm doing a dozen of these or 2 dozen, I'll usually dip a couple at a time. I'll let them drain for about 45 seconds to a minute, and then I'll move them over and let them continue to drip on my stand here. And so now you want to let these stand preferably on the first coat overnight, and then after that, about 2 hours before you then want to give each shaft just a light buffing. And when I say buffing, I'm not talking about using sandpaper. I'm just using a 3M pad similar to what you'd see on the back of a sponge. And it's just kind of taking any high points that might have developed, and then I'm brushing these off. And just a real quick note about crown dipping while we're here in front of the dipping station. This is a shorter tube that is now filled with paint, and this paint is going to be added to the upper 9 inches of my arrow shaft, once again, where the fletching is going to reside near the nock. And it's another way of just adding a nice decorative color to your shaft. It looks nice the way it is, or we'll take it a next step further and look at cresting. That kind of introduces the idea of decorating your arrow shafts. Now, one decoration was simply to stain it, and now we're going to take that a little bit further. If you're making some period arrows, you might want to use your own mark. You can make a little cross, you can make a little star. We'll show you an example of that in a moment. And that would just be a little thing that you can mark either with Sharpie pens or a small paintbrush just to make them yours. And that was a very period thing for many archers to do. As we talked about the crown dipping, you can also get into cresting, which is another variation, a little more modern, but it's going to give you another area of personalizing your arrows, so making them a little more attractive. This first example is Jenny is just painting a little or drawing a little cross on the arrows. Nice little symbol. Now this is the spin right cresting tool, and we're going to show you how easy it is to actually crest, which is putting concentric rings on your arrow shafts just to add more color and make them more decorative. She's loaded a shaft in the machine, and on the right-hand side, there's a little stop bar that'll keep the shaft in place. You want to make sure you look at the instructions to make sure that your rollers are all in the right place. And now by dipping some water-based paint, she's very carefully just applying the paint to the shaft. And by hand, she's just kind of saying, okay, this area is going to be about 1/8 of an inch. And she's adding the black on top of the yellow color. This is all real time, so you can see that you can get to be pretty quick. And when you do a dozen of these, by the time you're finished, you're going to be an expert at using this tool. Now, if you want to do a real thin line, Jenny's kind of taken a brush without any paint on it, add a little water and squeeze the end to make kind of a knife edge to that paintbrush. And she's very lightly going to touch right in the middle of that yellow and create a very thin line. And so it's very easy, very quick to make thin lines. You can add more colors as you go down the length of your shaft. Let's go back to that original mark that she made on the period arrow, and let's just add a little cresting to it. And the purpose for doing that is we're adding just a little more color, and this color is going to then highlight the mark that she made and just make it all a bit more decorative, a bit more unique. So now you can see you've got a nice pretty arrow there. Of course, after you add paint, you want to go ahead and add another dipping of sealer. And so we'll just kind of do that. So we did initial sealing already before we did the decoration. Now we're going to get to kind of a final sealing. And basically, as you saw in the video, that's just going back to your dipping tubes, dipping your arrow shafts another 2 to 3 times. I like to dip them once, and then I actually flip the shaft around. So for all of the previous dips, the nock has been pointing down, and now I'm moving the nock to the top. And the reason for doing that is just letting more of the sealer solution work its way down to the front of the arrow shaft where the point's going to be. Not a big deal, but that's just something I prefer. And so now you've completely sealed your shafts, and you're ready to add the nocks and points. So the nocks are going to be first. I use the same glue that I use for putting on the feathers, which is the fletched type platinum fletching glue. And this process, of course, is very straightforward if anyone's done their own nocks. I'm going to taper the tool in case you're wondering how I did it. So since I kind of mentioned it briefly earlier, using a tapering tool that's set for nocks. And oftentimes these tools have, on each end, they'll have a taper for the nocks, and then on the opposite end of the tool is a taper for the point. And it just allows you to use it like a sharpener. I'm going to add a little glue to it, and then I can simply press on the nock. I'm going to take that little ridge on the nock that I'm pointing to there and make sure it's in line with a mark that I made on the shaft earlier, which kind of told me where those rifts were running, which direction the rifts were running. and where my ultimate cock feather was going to end up. Now you also see behind me, it's just rolled around as another type of knock, which is a self knock, but it's a glued-on self knock. It's made out of wood, and so it works as a period knock. Now, if you want to cut your own, there's a jig that you can buy that will allow you to simply clamp it onto your wood shaft. And then it's got two openings to let you use a saw to cut your shaft opening or your string opening. And then there's a longer one there if you're actually interested in putting in some horn pieces, which was a very period thing to do underneath the opening for the string cutting area. They'd insert some horn to basically make the arrow stronger, especially when you're using 100-pound bows and 120-pound bows to protect the wood shafts. And so if you want to do your own shafts, this is a good tool to help you kind of cut those out. I haven't gotten into making self-knock arrows yet, so I won't go any further into the topic, but certainly a nice thing to do to get into period arrows. Fletching is pretty straightforward. The only thing I'd recommend to you is don't try to put your fletches too close to your nocks. Try to leave a little bit of space. Here I'm recommending about 1.5 inches, so that if you ever need to cut off your nock, if it gets broken by another arrow, you'll have enough room to use your tapering tool to actually resharpen it to then add a new nock. Let's go ahead and take you through using the fletching jig. First off, as I mentioned before, there's a variety of feathers out there, every color that you can imagine. My only caution to you is just be careful if you go for the barbed feathers. They're much more expensive, almost twice as expensive as the non-barbed feathers. And if you really want to cut down your cost, getting the full length feathers and then cutting them to the length that you want to use is going to save you some money. You'll then need to either use a chopping tool to cut them to the shape that you want, or even a burning tool that will burn the feathers into the shape that you define. Here is the Bittsburger jig that has been around for decades that most people tend to use. But if you do use a different one, simply follow the directions. They're all very similar. There's various clamps that you can use for either putting your feathers on if they're left wing feathers or right wing feathers, or depending on which orientation you prefer to use, there are clamps that let you do that. Traditionally, many right-handed bowers would use a left wing attachment or a left wing feather and then attach it using a left wing clamp. But other folks will argue that it really doesn't make any difference. You could use any direction you want. There's a couple of ways of attaching your feathers to the wood. I'm going to take you through both here in a moment. Just adjusting the tool. You'll see the 120 there represents the fact that each feather is going to be 120 degrees from the adjacent feather. And so that's set for doing 3 feathers, which is what most of us use. If you're doing corals, you might want them at 90-degree angles to each other. And so you might choose the next option. But you can choose, even 4 arrows or 4 feathers on the arrow if you so wish. Here we're adjusting the top of the jig to let you make sure that the clamp is in the middle of your arrow shaft. And there's also an adjustment for the bottom of the clamp to make sure that you can move it to the middle of the shaft. So to use this jig, you need to make sure you have the knock already on your shaft, because it's going to fit into a slot inside the tool. And if you'll notice where my right finger is, there's a flat section on that dial. That flat section is meant to orient itself with the cock feather. And so I am putting the shaft, or my wife is putting the shaft into the tool with the ridge on the knock pointing up, because we're going to put the cock feather on first, and that's going to orient with how the tool is set up right now.
What's the question that you got on fletching?
Okay, the question on fletching. In your experience, is there any drawback to having a large distance, e.g. 3+ inches from the knock to the back of the fletching?
3 inches, I mean, to me, it gets to be a question of aesthetics. If you like the look of it, I don't think there's any issues. Some people that do Asian archery will have extremely long shafts, and so that may look very appropriate. But I don't think it's going to cause any problems in terms of the arrow stabilizing. The only issue I would have too would be the fact that those feathers make contact or going to pass the front of the bow quicker. And I think my preference would be to give it a little more time. But I really don't have a clean answer on that question. It's nothing that I've really looked into. We're in the tool. You can see how turning the knob will adjust where you are. Um, we're going to show the first method of attaching feathers by using the glue method. This is what was used for years and years and years, which is simply to run a bead of glue down the length of the feather, which has been put inside the clamping tool. Now, putting the clamp at the bottom of the jig first, we're then going to press it on, and that clamp is being held on the jig with some strong magnets, so you need to kind of play with that and make sure you know how to work it. We're then going to let that sit 5 minutes so that the glue can cure. The newer method is using a double-sided tape, and here Jenny is applying the tape to the feather first, and she's going to make sure that it's making strong contact through the whole length of the feather. It's double-sided, so it's got a piece of film on it, so she's not going to have any problems with the glue until she removes that film. We then load that into the clamp, just like we did with the glue method, and then we're going to remove that film so that the glue is available. Same process, starting at the bottom of the jig, we're going to push that clamp onto the magnets, push it onto the wood, make sure that it makes contact through the whole length of the wood. And unlike gluing, we can now remove the clamp right away. And here Jenny's going to press down the length of the feather just to make sure that it made a solid contact all the way down. And then to finish, whether you're using the glue method or the double-sided tape, we're just going to put a little drop of glue at each corner of the front and back of the feathers just to make sure that there's a little extra uh, grip, since that's where the feathers take more of their abuse. All right, so that was fletching. Fletching is a lot of fun. It actually goes pretty fast. Anybody can do it. It's really not that hard. Applying points has a little more heat to it, and so it's just something that you got to get used to. But it's really not difficult for anyone to do. Before you get there, it's time to now cut your arrow shafts to the ultimate length that you want to use for the archer that you're making arrows for. So you're not only using their draw length, but you're adding maybe an extra inch or so. Then you've got maybe another 3/4 to allow for the tapering of the wood before you put the point on. And so you're going to cut all your shafts and then you're going to taper them using the tapering tools that you saw in the previous videos. The first thing is prepping the points, and using a Dremel, I'm just kind of removing any excess particles that are on the inside of the point, and then dipping a Q-tip into acetone. That's another way of cleaning out the inside of the point so that the glue is going to adhere to it just fine. Here's just another quick example of tapering uh, for the point. And now I'm using a torch, though you could use an alcohol burner, but I'm also putting the torch at a very light setting, so I'm not blowing it out hard. Here I'm melting the glue, which will be used for attaching the tips, and just adding the glue on here. You can actually do that for all of your arrows before you even uh, start the first. I'm heating up the point for about 12 to 15 seconds. You don't want it red hot. And then when you press it onto the shaft, you should see the glue start to kind of bubble out a little bit. and I'm just twisting and then pressing it really hard against a vise, and that pressure is going to help the point make good contact. I'm then using a sponge to both clean up the excess glue as well as cool down the tip a little bit. I'll typically hold it against the vise for about 45 seconds or so, and then I'll quench it in some water. And then any excess glue, I'll just use a utility knife to kind of scrape off. And if that doesn't quite get it all, I'll take some metal sandpaper and just kind of give it just a quick buffing to take off any remaining glue. And then pretty much your arrow's ready to go. But the last thing you should do is just make sure that that tip went on straight. I don't know if you can quite tell, but on the left side of this picture where the point is, there's a slight angle where the point's not fully in line with the shaft. And so I would then go back, grab my pliers, grab the tip, put it back onto the flame for about another 2 to 3 seconds. You'll find that it'll pop right off. I'll then either try gluing it again and see if that addresses the problem, or I might take off another quarter or half inch of wood off the shaft, retaper it, and then put a point back on. Sometimes you just have a bad part in the wood where it's not going to let you put the point on the way you want to put it on. If you've got a point that you don't like, because some store-bought arrows will come with arrows that will have a bullet type point on the end, and that bullet point is actually larger in diameter than the wood shaft. And the problem that gives you is when it gets stuck in a target, it's not going to want to pull out of the target very easily because there's a ridge there. And so I like to take some of those store-bought arrows and remove those points and put on my own points. And so the points, once again, are sold to match the diameter of the wood. So if I'm using a 5/16 inch shaft, I'm going to use a 5/16 point, and then you'll have a nice smooth transition from one to the other. It's easy to remove them. If you lose your point and it gets stuck in a target, then once again, it's easy to put a new point on. I usually will cut the wood down about 1/4 inch. I'll retaper it, I'll glue it, and then I'll apply a new point. And it's a very straightforward process. I like to go through the whole process. I'll be weighing my arrow shafts and comparing the weights. Sometimes I'll dip them extra just to add another 3 grains of weight. Ultimately, I'm trying to get each of my arrow shafts to be as close to each other in weight as possible. You don't have to do that. And if you order from the right companies, oftentimes they'll come within 10 grains of each other, which is plenty close to each other. It all depends on how crazy you want to be. But ongoing care is very important. You want to remove any moisture that your arrows might get. You can use a tassel on the archery field or just a cloth in the evening. I like using olive oil to clean off the ends of our arrows after we've used them.
It's coconut oil.
I'm sorry, coconut oil? Did I say olive oil?
You
Coconut
did.
oil. Sorry, coconut oil. Not, but probably the more important time is when you're transporting your arrows that they're actually going to get abused. And so I recommend to you, as opposed to just taking your arrows and putting them in the back of your car, stand them up behind the seats so that nothing ends up leaning against them, or even best, put them in an arrow tube. This way, if something should fall on the tube, it's not going to damage your equipment. That's most of what I wanted to cover.
There is a question from Tikezo. The pros and cons to flu feathers.
Feathers. So flu feathers are just larger feathers that are meant to kind of slow down your arrow in flight.
Minute, Louis.
And they can be useful, especially if you're shooting at targets like Naran will set up a target on a 40-foot pole. And so you don't want to be shooting your arrows and having them, just disappear into the distance. And so it's a way of kind of slowing down the arrow a little bit. I think they're fine if that's the type of archery you want to do. You're going to get used to how the arrow flies, just as you would if you had a smaller set of feathers. But for shooting the distances that we're shooting, which is typically 40 yards or less, when you look at Royal Rounds and other fun shoots. You don't need much of a feather on there at all because the arrow is not going a long distance and it's going to stabilize pretty quickly. So in my mind, a foo-foo feather would be kind of overkill. But if it's something that kind of adds to the look, then go for it. I wanted to take you through just a quick video on a spine measuring tool. You don't need to necessarily purchase this because, as I mentioned, you can get your shafts pre-spined. But here's one made by Ace. Their Model 107 spine spin tester. We're placing the arrow onto the tool with the cock feather pointing down. And the reason for doing that is we're going to use gravity to press down on this arrow shaft and make it bend. And so we're pressing down on it. If this arrow was actually on my bow, that cock feather would be pointing away from the bow and the arrow would be flexing away from the bow as it moved around the bow when I shot it. And so this is the orientation that we want to check the spine of the wood. If you tried checking it in other orientations, you'll probably get a different rating. And so you've got to be very consistent when you're testing any of your shafts to make sure that you're always doing it in the same fashion. So Jenny has just put in an arrow into the tool. Now we're going to zero it out. So she'll use this little adjusting knob. It'll set the measuring bar to 0 at the top there. And now we're going to use what has been a recognized standard, which is a 2-pound weight, which is going to put pressure on the wood to bend. And that's going to then tell you what your spine right here is. And that's basically 42 pounds for this particular arrow. So that's an easy way to kind of test your arrows, just to understand what their spine is. The spine of an arrow will change if you shorten the arrow. So if you bought your shafts and they're 32 inches long, they're going to have one spine rating. And if you shorten them down to 29 and a half inches, they're going to have a different spine rating. So that's where it's important to kind of be aware of what you're shooting. This is a little more expensive tool. Once again, you don't necessarily need to buy it. You can buy pre-spined shafts. But if you're going to be making lots of arrows and if you're really into this hobby, this is kind of a nice tool to have, and it's well made. Okay, so I think I'm coming to the end here, and I've given you a list of resources that you can go to. The two main distributors for archery related equipment are Three Rivers and Lancaster. Three Rivers does cater more to wood arrows, and so they'll have more products dedicated to wood arrows. Some of the tools that you saw in this video are then highlighted on this list, and you can find them probably at either of these two companies. But if you want to order arrow wood shafts that are pre-spined and pre-measured, Kellswood and Rose City are two good options for you. We do most of our ordering through Kellswood for the Woodmasters Hill area. Stains, sealers, and paints, as I mentioned, I like the Minwax wood finishes. And just to make another comment about chemicals, you have the world of wood chemical or water-based chemicals, and you have the world of oil-based chemicals. And you want to try not to mix the two. Some people will say they love oil-based, and that's the only way they'll go. The only problem you'll run into is if you try to put a water-based paint or cresting color on top of an oil-based stain, you might have some incompatibilities where the paint wants to chip off or will even bleed off. And so I highly recommend that you try to standardize and go with a water-based stain with water-based colors. But having said that, the testers enamel-based paints that I used as a kid when making models, those same paints are still available and they work great whether you're putting them on top of water-based stains or even oil-based stains. They'll cover just about anything and they'll give you nice, vibrant colors. Most of my process follows a process that is dictated on the Addictive Archery videos from 2024, and he takes you through his process for making arrows. So I highly recommend his videos to you. And then if you just start telling yourself, no, this is too complex, I don't want to get into this right now, No Frontiers has a nice set of arrows that that you can order from and dictate the spine that you want to use and dictate. Oftentimes they'll come pre-measured as well.
One quick question for you in the last 2 minutes. Is there another way to affect spine or adjust spine other than length?
Yes. The spine, once again, is the flexibility of the arrow shaft, and your tip can have a strong effect on that. The point can have a strong effect on it. So let's say I was using an arrow that had a 100-grain tip on it, and that arrow, as I shot it, just appeared to be too stiff, and it wasn't working its way around the bow well enough. I could put a heavier point, 125-grain point, on that arrow instead, and that heavier point would force the wood to bend or to be a little more flexible, because in a sense the string is pushing the arrow from the backside of the arrow, and that point is kind of holding up the front side of the arrow from moving initially, and that's going to cause the wood to flex a little bit more. So using a heavier point can make your shafts a little more flexible as they're being used, or the dynamic spine. So the reverse can be true too. If you found your arrows were just too flexible, go down to a lighter tip. Also, the lighter tip versus a heavier point. If you're shooting longer distances and you have a lighter bow, you probably want to have a lighter arrow. If you're shooting shorter distances, it probably doesn't matter either way, but try to avoid being crazy about having a big honking arrow if you're using a 25-pound bow. So, any other questions, or are we good to wrap up now? So I appreciate everybody's time. I appreciate you joining us today. I threw a lot of information at you. I'm happy to send this presentation to you, or at least make it available to you. And I encourage you, it is not that difficult to make your own arrows. You just have to kind of jump into it, give it a go. And I can help step you through the easier methods of kind of getting started. And then as you progress, you'll be teaching me how to do more of the advanced things. So thanks so much for your time today, and look forward to seeing you on the field.